Okay, great. It's very weird doing this sitting down. So that's me for people that haven't met me. So I'm here at Euro Money for a little while, but I've worked at a load of places building stuff you might have heard of. Basically, I gave your money to charity, then gave you pizza for it, and let you call your mate about it, and text donations, and all sorts of stuff. So I work in London trying to help people do software development a bit better, trying to make people work with a little more agility and behave themselves a little bit and be responsible and accountable and grown up. And that's me drinking rum in the Caribbean, which was delicious. Absolutely delicious. Love rum.
Wow, this is new.
So, origins. So how many of you here actually have to write user stories? Yeah, a couple. Cool. So the reason that we do it is that as Agile development picked up, a gulf was observed between the quality of requirements and their implementations, hence the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Actually, I think that's to do with subsidence in the land rather than poor building practices. But basically what people said they wanted and what was actually being done were very, very different. People were spending a lot of time building large specifications for software that never existed, that were very rigid and left no room for maneuver. And I can't stress this enough, all of those 100+ pages of requirements, nobody ever built those systems. It didn't happen, it was fiction. It's the greatest work of fiction this side of the Bible. It's brilliant. But a whole industry was based around it for 30 years, and it was a miserable, miserable time. And ultimately, that's what was happening. People were ending up shipping something to spec that wasn't what the customer actually wanted, because let alone the fact that they weren't reading the specifications and failing to implement them, everything had changed between the point of someone deciding to write the specification and anyone actually bothering to write any software. Basically, the maximum level of success for a project was all down to interpretation. So it fell between the gulf of how well someone could express their needs and the quality of the interpretation that someone implementing it had of those needs. That was magnified by the moves in the early 90s to things like outsourcing, which is obviously something that still happens here, whether you describe it as co-sourcing or insourcing. Geographic distribution and time delays between writing specifications and formal language around software and building them gets more complex with every leap. So if you have a language barrier, you fall further down into the hole. If you have a time barrier, you fall further down into the hole. And if you can't communicate at all, you're doomed. No. So all of those things snowballed up into this big state of the 100-page spec, because people, using project management methodologies like ITIL and all the other horrible British Computer Society things from the 80s, and all the big project management techniques came in and said, okay, this is falling out of control, this is not working, so what do we need to do? Well, we need rigor around that documentation, and we need accuracy, this must be perfect. And then they built the ivory tower of not implemented. So yes, the knowledge gap was the best possible outcome, and it took about 100 years. Or actually, in some cases, look at projects like the failed NHS project in England, which is a very, very recent early 2000s failure. It's a mere 6 or 7 years of about £1 billion worth of failure, rather than just a little piddly failure in a small company. And this stuff was really systematic. So this is really, really good. I'll let you take it in. So this is XKCD describing how to write good code. And honestly, that's a little bit like reality. That's a little bit like reality right there. So user stories was the violent reaction to this. So it all kind of came out of the Agile XP Scrum movements of the very late 90s and early 2000s as Agile development. I would like to say swept through the industry, but the truth is 10 guys in a room shouted really loudly about it, and in about a decade's time, people started listening to them. But as this movement started to pick up, people started evaluating ways where they could make decisions just in time. So a lot of it was influenced by Lean, which is something that kind of came from manufacturing and Toyota, and lots of just-in-time scheduling of work. So user stories offered a structured way of capturing user requirements, much like the big requirements documents, but they lacked all of the ceremony, which made them immensely better. Just out the door, they lacked all the ceremony. They weren't big, they weren't long, and they were very, very much user-focused rather than business-focused. And what I mean by that is it wasn't the middle manager in this department here wants a system that does this exact thing because someone he spoke to this one time says he wants a system. User stories make you focus on the user, focus on the actual use cases. And, use cases existed in specifications, but they were part and parcel of them. They were often the middle chapter in 100 pages, whereas what they said is actually all the rest of that stuff is rubbish. It's rubbish, it doesn't help us, so let's bring them right all the way up to the top and focus on the bit that had value. And that is something that a lot of the agile methodology stuff has in common, where what they really did is they say, we value all this stuff, there's loads of good stuff here, but actually the stuff that really worked and was really important was actually just this bit and that bit and that bit. So why bother with doing all the rest? So this is probably not news to you guys if you've written user stories before, but yeah, nice Leonardo da Vinci picture of anatomy, very good. He's a much smarter man than I am. Seems really simple, right? As a persona, I want goal so that benefit. Really, really obvious, really, really tight, really, really specific, until you actually look at what those things are. So what is a persona, what is a goal, and what is a benefit? So the persona aspect of a user story helps the implementer understand the type of user they're targeting. The goal is the desired result. And it's really, really important that you know who your personas are, and I'll talk about them a lot later. But suffice to say, if every story you write says as a user, you probably don't know who you're talking about. There's no such thing as a user. No more than you are man and you are woman. There is no user. So why those things? So the benefit is actually one of the most important things in my opinion, because it contextualizes. It brings understanding and it helps the teams with prioritization and the programmers understand the why they're building things. Ultimately, people that know why they're doing something will do a better job of it because they understand the context. And just like in everything in the entire world, context is very, very important. So a couple of qualities around stories. So stories should be objective. Avoid phrases like easily or quickly. Easily doesn't mean anything. What is easy to you may not be easy to me. Quickly means absolutely nothing. It's something that we fall into in technology all the time. Quickly depends on the category of thing you're building. If you're building bulk data processing, quickly can be measured in days or hours. If you're building a web page, quickly can be measured in milliseconds to seconds. And if you're measuring it in minutes or hours, you're so far off the deep end. These things are not comparable, and you should make sure you don't treat them like that. They don't help the team understand when they're done. And to help the team understand where they're done, you need tightly defined acceptance criteria. So if you're writing user stories without acceptance criteria, you're making a mistake, because then done is up to the interpretation of the people building the thing rather than what you actually want. Story should not solution. And this is really prevalent in a technical focused business, because technical user stories often struggle to ask the question rather than say what they want to be done. We should focus on posing questions and defer decision making to the teams and the people involved in building products. Otherwise, all you're really doing is saying, build that thing. And if you think that you know more about building the thing than the people that are building it when they come to build it, you're sorely mistaken. Because as is the nature of all kinds of estimating or crystal ball gazing, it's like a shotgun. You know a lot when you're very, very close, very, very close. But very, very quickly, you lose focus very, very quickly. And that goes for projecting timelines as well as projecting implementations of features. Doing that blinkers the team. At the moment you say, we'll build it like this, they'll stop thinking of other ideas. They'll stop using their creative faculties, and they'll start saying, oh, well, how are we going to build this very specific thing that you just asked me for? So ask for what you want. Don't tell them how to build it. So there are a few variants on the traditional user story. That's a palette variant in Mario. So some people think so that's optional. They're definitely, definitely wrong. I was a lot more polite in the slide, but they're definitely, definitely wrong. Stories without context is an anti-pattern. All that means is the person writing the story either is holding his cards or her cards close to their chest. They don't want to share the context, which is hilariously dysfunctional, or they don't correctly understand the context to be able to distill it, in which case you shouldn't be doing the work yet anyway. If you can't write the context, you probably shouldn't build the software. I quite like this though. Some people alternate between I want and I need to signpost required or optional functionality. It's quite a good way to write stories that you can use in prioritization. So here are some things that we absolutely need. Here are some nice to have features that aren't really super important and aren't high in the priority list. But when you write the stories down, before you go through and you prioritize them, actually, they don't have any order. So keeping that in the language of the story is quite helpful. It's good for product owners. But yes, to reiterate my point, or indeed to play a slide that I should have played earlier, tell me what, not how. A user story is just the start. They are conversations. They don't dictate an implementation, and they should be short and succinct. So that we've got a little bit more on this later. So why use this format? Why use this format at all? Is it worth using? So user stories force authors to describe things succinctly. They highlight requirements are large and need breaking down. They're artifacts in your planning sessions. They're useful when requirements or implementations are volatile, and they encourage conversations between owners and developers. And I can't press enough how important conversations are. The user stories are the hint, they're the spark, they're the start, they're not the end. And this is one of my big problems with digital tracking tools like Jira, in that they manifest conversations as trackable technical artifacts, and trackable technical data entered artifacts are less liable to change than opinions and conversations. It's one of the things that we lost in the wash from moving to physical boards to digital tracking, is that when you had a physical card with a bunch of post-it notes, it was incredibly easy to go, that doesn't make any sense, chuck it in the bin, write another one to replace it, and nobody really saw any ceremony in that. But when you wrap that in the ceremony of, oh, well, are we marking this ticket as resolved? Then how about this task? Do we need to move it out of the sprint? How about we close it? Can we just delete it? All of a sudden, that conversation is both meaningless and a waste of time. So people are less likely to change once the things are in the system because they feel like it's somehow enshrined in stone. So, I mean, this is really the fulcrum, the middle of a user story is knowing when you're done. A user story is used to simply describe a discrete feature that is done at a certain point. So acceptance criteria are traditionally written on the back of the card, and they are how you know when you're done, and you're not until they're all complete. So that means don't write acceptance criteria that can't be measured, that can't be tested, that are not empirical. Anything that's woolly, anything that's based on, well, let's see how users like it when we ship it to live, all that'll do is it'll keep your story trapped in that workflow. People will forget about it, and your board will slowly fall into disrepair. So it's a little bit, I don't know if you've heard of the phrase kind of broken window syndrome, where you break one window in a abandoned apartment complex and then wait about a week and every other window will be broken. If you fix that one window, it probably doesn't happen. So it's the idea that if you let any of this stuff get into disrepair, everything follows very, very quickly on the back of it. But good acceptance criteria must work in IE6. Must be accessible is a bad acceptance criteria. What is accessible? It's a good example of a terrible one. So a good alternative, so I forget the name of the standard, so I can't express it, but there is an accessibility standard guidelines. Right? So you can say must meet sections 1 to 6 of the accessibility guidelines laid out here. That's a good acceptance criteria because you can measure it and prove that it works. Must output logging information or failure. That's really good. The reason that's a good acceptance criteria rather than a bad one is because it's vague enough that the developer can choose what the appropriate level of logging output is, but it says it must be there. So it's not so specific as to be shackling, but it's very direct and testable. You should be able to write a unit test or behavior-driven test around an acceptance criteria without fail. Anything that you build, because unit test all the things, absolutely all of the things. I love that slide, brilliant. So Bill Ward in the early 2000s set out a really nice way to remember some of these qualities. I think it was 2003. I believe it was part of investing good user stories and smart acceptance criteria, I believe was the title of the blog post. So user stories should be independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. So independent is self-evident. So a story should stand alone, it should be tested alone, and it should be deployed and delivered alone, if where possible. So, I mean, this is quite interesting, again, when you think of technically focused stories. So say you've got a team that's building an API, well, how do you make that testable? Yeah, do we have to integrate it into a system? Well, actually, no, you can change your products so that the stories are testable. So I think it was one of the teams in the building I was talking to about an API they were building that would send an email. And they said, when it works, the API does nothing, it just doesn't fail. I said, okay, well, that's all well and good, but how can you test that and ship it independently? Simply by saying, when you write that API, return a blob of JSON to the screen that says, I sent an email. That's enough that you can then ship that story and verify it independently. So feel free to slightly change the way you write stories to satisfy the way you want to work with them, because giving yourself that little extra bit of visibility means that you can prioritize those stories differently, and you have extra tools and extra visibility into your system. So the stories actually, by focusing on these qualities, will drive out good behaviors in the systems that you build. Negotiable, very important, and I've been alluding to it for the past 10 or 15 minutes, is that a user story isn't a contract. It's a contract with the business at the highest possible level, but it should not go into detail. Detail is inflexible. You don't know what the answer is, you're just guessing. So it should always be a conversation. And actually, one of the things I really like is for people that write user stories, so product owners, to bring in draft user stories into planning meetings, to read them out and then rewrite them with the developers. So if you've got a digital tracking system, it's a good place to bridge the gap between the physical and the digital. So the PO will bring in some cards with scribbles of ideas and acceptance criteria. And as you talk through it, you explain the context, you explain what it is. You can say, oh, actually, I don't quite understand that. How about if we phrase it like this? Or can we split this into two stories that looks like this and that?
So just to understand, negotiable is meaning during the process to write the stories, they are negotiable, but once that you have written a final stories, it shouldn't be negotiable.
So you should
it should stay.
So the stories should not be tied to a technical implementation. The what you want to do is very high level and business focused. That probably won't change once you've got it down.
So the idea is that it should be at the end negotiable for the technical implementation, but for a user perspective, it has to be no negotiable.
Yes, to do it. Okay, so I'll give you a good example. Yes. So, say I've got a system which does data imports, and the user says, I want to add a feature to export all the data into an Excel spreadsheet. So I can write a user story up that says, add button, when I press button, Excel spreadsheet of data downloads. What they really wanted might have been to aggregate or count one column. So it could be that the more accurate user story that would serve the user need, if they were asking a question rather than solutioning, would be, I want a way to see the sum of this column of this data. So they've made the mental leap of, I want to do that in Excel. If I want to do that in Excel, I want to have an export. And if I want to have an export, then I need a button. So I need a button that downloads an Excel file so I can get it in Excel and I can sum those columns. When actually the simpler implementation may very well be that statistic already exists in the system, render statistic on page. So the user need is, I want to be able to see the total of this. One possible solution is we export it to an Excel file and they do it themselves along with some other things. Another possible solution is let's render it on the page because we have that data. But the user story that should have existed was I want a way to see that number rather than I want an Excel export. So make sure that the negotiations happen there about making sure what you're building is the right thing. Valuable, very, very obvious. We should be thinking about the user. We should be thinking about the user at all times. And that doesn't mean necessarily people outside. There are many different kinds of users. Systems administrators are users. Developers are certain kinds of user. Customers, people that make money, are a certain kind of user. In-house support staff are a different kind of user. Estimable. This kind of ties into the small. I really am not sure why he separated the two things out. Something that's large you can't estimate, and something that's small you can. They're intrinsically linked. But there should be enough information on the card to be able to succinctly estimate, or at least stick a finger in the air and say it's kind of hard or kind of easy. Small, so it's funny because if you look back in time when this post was originally written, I think one of the things you said was that most teams like stories that can be measured in a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. And I read that today and I kind of go, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, that's terrifying, right? Think in half days. Half days is a more useful metric. There's only so many half days you can lose. That's the thing. If you have something so small that if you get it 100% wrong, and all it does is it costs you 2 guys for a day, not the end of the world. You'll get over it. If it costs you two guys for 3 weeks, that's expensive. We live in London. Software people are very expensive. You don't want to waste that kind of money. So think really small.
So if you're estimating in terms of days,
no, you don't estimate in days.
you wouldn't really. So I mean, if you're kind of abstracted away from the implementation, you like pointing or something, don't you?
Yeah. So think small. Ultimately, so really, if you're going to do a user story, if you're getting bigger than a medium, to be honest, doesn't matter what scale people use, from t-shirt sizes to escalating numbers. If you start to get to your medium, you're probably using that. So people always score up when they're confused. That's the rule, right? In planning sessions, you talk about something, you don't spend hours and hours and hours discussing it. If it gets too complicated, you say, okay, let's go up. What does that really mean? It means I'm confused. I don't know how hard this is, so I'm going to pad. And that's fine. Like, it's the sensible thing to do as a professional, is say, oh, well, I'm not going to say it's ready for tomorrow when I don't know about all these things. But what you really should be thinking is, okay, well, we've got a big thing here. Can we cut that in half? So can we spike a few things and do just the bit we know? Can we take the bit we know and change the story slightly so we can deploy it independently? And then when we work out how hard building the next bit is, we plug the two things together. You know, once you get past, I mean, you don't ever want a large story on your board, put it that way. Ever, ever, ever. Like a large story should be, oh my God, let's get out of here. Let's cut this down. Let's rethink. It's very, very hard. It takes a lot of discipline, a huge amount.
Does that kind of wrap in a little bit to independent then, David? And I misunderstood independent, because when you say an independent story,
yeah,
in some situations, there's all sorts of, there's more than one feature.
So you're talking about the union between stories and features and sagas and big holistic product features, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
It does tie into that. I think independent, in my mind and in my eyes, means I can ship this. I can ship this and it won't break the farm. It'll be useful, it'll be testable. It could be useful to a different category of user. So for instance, in a system that ships email, say the one that was designed here, there's an API to trigger an email and something that schedules those. Those are two things. The feature isn't complete until those two parts are shipped, but as a story, you can ship the two parts independently. The sequencing, one must come before the other. But it's saying that actually the first bit is useful to the developer of the next feature because it gives him meaningful feedback, it's testable, it's expected behavior, it's discrete. So those are all positive qualities in your system. That's shippable, it's testable, high five everybody.
Because that's really going to be around the conversation with the developer. Because me as a product manager, I would not...
You don't necessarily know.
No, exactly, that's just what I was going to say. That's what I mean. It's to divvy it up afterwards. Because for me, it's about that journey. The story could be the customer has this start and that end.
You got it.
I'm just that one piece, but there's a few in there.
And to drag it
like that.
And to drag it all the way back to conversations.
Yeah.
So the one of the tenets of a good practicing agile team is the conversation shouldn't be one way.
Right.
The developers should be just as vocal and just as involved in crafting what these stories are as you are, because they have just as much of a stake. You're under the cosh if you don't deliver the kind of things that people want, but if you give them things that they can't build, they're equally stuck. Like, it should be a two-way dialogue, and you should refine it over time. And the truth is, with these kind of processes, teams fall into a cadence where they know each other, they estimate together, they write stories in complementary ways. But a lot of it relies on people talking, and that's the people over processes bit of the original Agile Manifesto. It's about people, and that's why these meetings are important. We're here talking about it rather than just kind of winging it. It's super important.
Very quickly, I found that really frustrating when I first started out a while back. Just that conversation of just going, I don't know how you chop this up. For me, that is a start and end. But obviously the developers go, well, I need to complete that one, then that one can start, then that one can start. It breaks up into three.
Consider dragging them into your initial story writing.
No, absolutely, yeah, that's right.
Bring it all further up. So, okay, I'm going to write a story for a technical thing. I'm a bit out of my depth here. I kind of know what the product should be.
Sure.
Let's get a 5 or 10 minute or a half-hour conversation going, just to help you seed some ideas way before it's ever scheduled for work, but just to help those ideas mature. And obviously the T for testable is the unit testable thing slide. It must be testable. And, I'll bend. People, maybe a human test, maybe an automated test, preferably an automated test. Anything that you don't want to break in future should be tested. Simple rule. So that brings us across to personas. So a persona, plural persona, or personas, in the words everyday usage, is a social role or a character played by an actor. It's like golf clap. Thank you, Wikipedia. So what does that even mean? So in user experience and marketing, a persona is a fake user that represents a segment of your user base. Your user story should satisfy one of your personas because they represent your customers. So personas are an interesting way of thinking about whether this feature is meeting the needs of a specific demographic. I believe originally it was a marketing thing. It was a targeted marketing discipline. But they're really, really useful in software. I can't remember what the next slide is, so I'm just going to check. If you're always writing as a user, you might not know who your feature is for.
What about a user type?
So
Closer.
They are closer. They are closer as a user that only comes to our site to get this particular thing. But they're kind of personas. They're the vestibules of personas showing. You have personas there, but you're using a type to describe them rather than characterizing them. They're useful, and well-known personas are helpful for understanding segments of your audience. So I think there's an example of a very, very brief persona here. I've got a real good screenshot and a couple of slides. So this could be a very, very simple persona. This is how he was introduced to our product. These are the things he's interested in. So say you're doing a broad editorial website rather than a targeted one. Those interests are useful. Make sure that the things that you capture in your personas are relevant to the kinds of products you put together. Don't just take this as a template and run with it. The personas should really be helpful for you. They're a crutch. So
sorry, David, back into this is an example of user story. John first used features because of motivation.
No, it's just it's explaining some context.
It's just to explain.
Again, context is everything, both the user stories and then personas.
So this is the context.
So drawing pictures actually helps. So I tell you what's really, really fun. One of the great ways you can do project kickoffs. So I'll pose a question. You have some budget to build a product that addresses a theme. You don't know what you're going to build. You don't know who you're building it for. What do you do? How do you do it? So the first thing is refine some personas. Okay, so you know nothing. So first let's make something up. Who are our target audience? Who are we building products for? And a really great game you can play is get all the people in the team in the room, split them up and get them to draw some personas. Big whiteboards like that, get them to draw pictures that capture character aspects. It's a really fun, there's a really great book called Game Storming that has loads of this stuff in it.
Roman Pitchler did some stuff like that with his persona boards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you make persona boards, you describe those characters, you describe their needs and their wants, and you build archetypes, because archetypes are really, really useful. And then you keep them around. So now you design a product. Okay, so we don't know what product we're building yet, we just know some people. So then you shuffle groups and get each of the groups to come up with 3 product ideas that match the persona they're standing next to. And then the product owner moves around the groups and says, "Oh, I like that element. Oh, I like that element. Oh, a little bit more of that. Actually, I want to target this guy more." And you can go through a refinement where you take more of this, less of that approaches to designing a product ad hoc and say, "Oh, I think this is cool, but I think this user over here isn't served well enough. What kind of features could we build for him?" And you can spend an afternoon designing some personas and literally scratching a product out of sand. And then you can test it. You can test the viability of this. And what you've done is you've used nothing but a set of personas to come up with a brand new product idea for an unknown audience out of nothing but a broad theme. So they're useful in games like that. Really, really helpful. Especially if you time box a week or something for ideation and inception. Really, very helpful. MailChimp does an awesome job of personas. Like, you should check out their blog if you want to see how you can do personas really, really well, because they go full fat. They've got job roles, they've got photos, they give you the feels, and then they hit you right in the feels. They make you really understand. And they clearly got their design team to do a good job on them, which helps. But it helps because it gives your team inspiration, and it makes your team think like their audience are real people. Because a lot of the problems in software development come when you put lots and lots of computers between the people that the developers are serving and the people themselves. So technical user stories, as I've been alluding to repeatedly, often struggle, but there are technical personas. The guy that builds software on my API, totally a real guy. DevOps guy on call, don't want to make him mad. He'll be really, really angry if you make your farm burn. The release manager, also don't want to make him mad because you can't ship anything. They're all valid personas, and the kind of the cool thing about technical personas is actually you could take photos of them because you probably know who they are. You've met them, you work with them. You can use them. Would this really, really make Dave in ops angry? If I did this feature, would he be really, really angry when the site goes down and I can't come and you can't log on and check a couple of metrics? Oh, well, it seems like we must write some metrics into this feature because they're really, really important. Otherwise, we can't monitor it. Those kinds of things are the legitimate motivation, and they're just as legitimate as, will I make external user angry if I break this feature? You should treat them as quality metrics of your software. Basically, the personas help you focus on when your technical task is actually done, because those guys have to be happy. And that's the highest res photo of that happy baby meme on the whole internet. It's like a 4 meg image. I just found it on a Google image search. I was unbelievable that there is a high res version of that. So yeah, briefly, some more XKCD. I think this describes product dev quite well. So tasking, very, very briefly. On physical user stories, tasks are often manifested as sticky notes attached to the card. Really, really good, really tangible, because you can change them a lot. Digital systems reproduce them as checklists and subcards. Anecdotally, because I know you guys use Jira, I hate subtasks to the very core of my being because they're inflexible, because they're high ceremony. I always prefer a quick bullet point list of tasks inside a story because they're really easy to change. Really easy to change. And also they don't lead to this horrible board explosion where you have about 12 stories for one thing and you try and move the story and it says, oh, well, you've not completed all the subtasks, and you scream at the computer and say, yes, I have. I just didn't remember to go and keep your internal accounting system up to date with the fact that I did those 3 things, which were actually 4 lines of code. Like, I find that subcards in Jira give me the nerd rage more than a lot of things.
I find them quite difficult as well, especially when they're referred to. They go, have you looked at the URL on the story? What URL? Oh, it's in subtask 819. I'm like, what?
It's like, and I care why. I just think that the best we can do with digital boards is make them as close to physical boards as we humanly can.
Yeah.
Right? They shouldn't be difficult. They shouldn't have workflow restrictions and all this horrible stuff that stops people behaving naturally. You know, if you think about it back to basics, all the digital board is meant to be is a digital representation of your behavior. Your behavior isn't making a piece of software feel happy. That's busy work rather than real work. Tasking should be detailed enough to help you estimate, but always be open to change. Always, always, always. And devs should feel completely enfranchised to go, yeah, no, I'm going to go and have a 2-minute conversation with the product owner because we put a task on here, and either it doesn't make any sense, or we don't need it, or actually I need to add 10 things. And what that really means is I need to split this up into another story because, oh my God, I just got really close to this problem and it's a lot bigger than I ever imagined. Those are all reasonable things to do as long as you talk about them. When it goes wrong is when people in dev or PMs do that with wild abandon without talking. Oh, I had this other cool idea. Oh, I'm just going to sneak an extra acceptance criteria into there. If you ever get the urge to do that, that should be through the conduit of conversation, never in a silo. So tasking is there to help. The other thing I see happening with tasks is people going into planning meetings and you pull a story, and before you can estimate it, you need at least 20 minutes of discussion to itemize all the tasks. Nope, no, that's implementation. All you're doing there is sitting and implementing in your head the feature so you can try and accurately estimate to build up a nice little mini waterfall. Don't bother. If tasking is that arduous, a nice antidote to that is, okay, how many things quickly on one sentence? Oh, we're kind of going to build a controller and a view thing and a bit of JavaScript and API. Cool, that's like 4 things, so there's some complexity there. Okay, cool. Are those hard things to build? Yeah, no? Okay, yeah, they're hard. Okay, estimate up, done. And then what the developer should do is when they pull that story card, they should grab another dev and say, okay, can you sit and task this with me for 10, 15 minutes? So defer the horrible pain of tight tasking to exactly the moment when it needs to happen, because you might find by the time you come to do that story, you've finished a couple of other stories that actually facilitate that story much, much easier, and half the tasks you would have spent 20 minutes talking about are irrelevant anyway. So the closest to just in time, the better. Summary. I like that. Summary. Visual puns.
I got that.
I think the jokes are better if I don't explain them. We use user stories to stay focused on the end result of our work, to focus on the what, not the how, and to aid in estimation and tracking with visual workspaces, to keep us focused on done. And that's the takeaway at the end. Bang. Any questions?